Correct.
Narcissists are charming. They grab people in. I mean, if we look around, heroes, leaders, celebrities, there are narcissists everywhere. I think the more challenging part, which we'll go into, is what if it's when it's your child or your parent or your partner or your friend. Welcome to Spiritually Hungry. Today we would like to welcome Dr. Ramani. We're very excited to have you today. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm personally very excited to speak to you about this topic of narcissism. I remember when I had an aha moment where I went through like the first half of my life so far, thinking that everybody was normal, whatever that means, or typical just like me. And I remember when I would encounter people that were difficult, or no matter what I tried or whatever tool I grabbed from my toolkit, especially spiritual practices, nothing worked with certain people. And so I got curious and I started to research and study. And sometimes, obviously information is knowledge, and having kind of this outlook and understanding of the way people are wired differently and helps us navigate in a way where we don't then turn to ourselves that we're not good enough, or we didn't try hard enough, or that we're not spiritual enough, or however we want to fill in the blank. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. I again, reading your book and also watching a lot of your interviews, it really opened up.
Check out the book's great. I just want to start, I want to read a little bit from your introduction in your book. It's Not You. And it's How Did We Get Here? And I just thought this was really interesting, because I think for our listeners, it might be relatable for them. And you give a few different examples of what a hypothetical day in your office looks like. So 9 a.m., Carolina has 2 children and was betrayed and cheated on by her husband several times during their 20-year marriage, including with friends and neighbors. After he denied it repeatedly, and then after enduring his rage for her paranoid accusations, she was told the affairs were her fault for making him feel he wasn't important. She would minimize her career so he felt safe. She struggled with missing what she believed was a beautiful life and family they created, with feeling not enough, believing that maybe she was misunderstanding him and the situation, knowing it was breaking her heart every time he criticized and betrayed her trust. That's one person. This one I thought was even more painful. This is at 10:30 a.m. Natalia has been married for 50 years to a man who told her that she was being ridiculous for expecting so much of him when she had cancer. I can't even read that without getting like a little thing in my throat. Mm-hmm. He said it was disruptive and throwing him off because now he was supposed to feel sad for her and upend his busy schedule to pick her up from chemotherapy appointments. She found it difficult to walk after developing neuropathy following years of cancer treatment, and he would shame her and call her the Empress for asking to be dropped off in front of a restaurant instead of walking 5 blocks on a cold night. However, they have adult children and grandchildren and a life filled with travel and family time. Natalia doesn't want to be the one responsible for messing up a lifestyle that everyone is enjoying. And she acknowledges that on more than a few days, she enjoys her husband's company. They still have a decent sex life and share history. Despite having both a medical and law degree, he treats her like a personal assistant. She has struggled with ongoing health conditions, self-blame, and shame, and has become socially isolated from everyone except her close family. And you go on. And why I wanted to bring this up is because I think the way our brains work, we like to be black and white about things to make sense of them. Mm-hmm. So somebody would look at a relationship like that and say, well, why wouldn't she leave? Why is she sacrificing her whole life? And then you write about how they do enjoy times together. They do have a good sex life, et cetera. So that could be confusing. And the other thing I would love for you to clarify is, because I think often people look, especially friends, they'll look into a friend's relationship or family members, and they'll say, well, you're just married to a jerk, or they're just unkind, or they're not spiritual. What is the difference between being just like a cruel, not nice person and somebody, and this example, let's look at Natalia's husband, for instance.
Well, at a minimum, Natalia's husband is cruel and not nice.
Yeah,
okay,
that's true.
That is already built into the model. In a case of Natalia's, though, it's consistent, right? We're seeing sort of certain features of this, particularly his cruelty around her medical illness. But it is when the cruelty and the not niceness is consistent and pervasive and characterizes all pretty much the majority, not all, because she said there's good moments, 80, even 80% of the relationship. And nothing Natalia did changed his behavior, right? So it's the unremitting unkindness, but the unwillingness to change. And I think in all of these cases, the piece to remember is that these are people, the partners in both of these cases, were presenting in society as good people. That's people that they're successful and they were leaders in their community and they're family men and all of that. So there is this capacity for a person who's only cruel might be cruel all the time to all people. And when that happens, they're cruel to everybody. Even in a meeting, in a board meeting, they'd be screaming at people, screaming at their colleagues. Everyone then has a conception of this as not being a nice person. The tricky piece with narcissism is they care deeply. A narcissistic person cares deeply on how they're viewed by other people. So they have this capacity to maintain these two repertoires. They're sort of forward facing to the world repertoire where they're charming and confident and charismatic and grandiose and come on into my house and have a cocktail kind of person. But this really unempathic, seemingly inconvenienced by people who are in their worst pain. And that confuses somebody in the relationship because they're thinking everybody else thinks he's a nice guy. I'm having such a different experience, right? So I think if somebody was cruel 24/7 to everybody, it would actually be easier for a person in a relationship with them to get support because everybody would say, oh my gosh, poor Natalia, she's in a relationship with a sadist. But that's not what Natalia was experiencing. Natalia was in a world where her husband was viewed as a pillar of the community.
Well, it's so interesting because I'm sure Natalia was attracted to him at first because she saw that forward-facing version of him, right? Correct. Narcissists are charming. They grab people. And I mean, if we look around, heroes, leaders, celebrities, there are narcissists everywhere. I think the more challenging part, which we'll go into, is what if it's when it's your child or your parent or your partner or your friend? And how do you maintain those relationships if you must or you choose to, well, I guess keeping your sanity and sense of self-worth, right?
Well, a lot of people have to maintain these relationships. In fact, I would say about 50% of people stay in at least one primary narcissistic relationship. It may not be a partner or spouse, but it may be a parent, it may be an adult child, it may be a sibling, it may be a job they keep showing up to. So there's really no version of this where somebody eliminates people with these personalities from all areas of their lives. So that's not the only path. It's one of many paths, is this idea of I'm going to just remove this person from my life. In most cases, people have to figure out the workarounds. And a lot of what It's Not You is about is how do you heal even when you still have to have a pretty regular contact with somebody who's narcissistic.
So the people that you see, most of them maintain a healthy, how do you create healthy boundaries, I guess?
You don't. It's not healthy. There's no, this is a very unfortunate piece of radically accepting that there's no healthy version of this, but the alternative is not always accessible to people. When people have minor children, they may not be able to leave. Family court is notoriously cruel to people who are going through emotional abuse and will not make decisions about child custody that's in the interest of the children. So people will sometimes stick it out so their child isn't spending 50% of their time with an emotionally abusive parent. Or a person can't leave a long-term marriage or any marriage because they don't have the money. They can't afford to pay 2 rents. There's no means to do that. So there are hard realities here to how people stay. Is the relationship that's created healthy? No. Is there any kind of healthy boundary with a narcissistic person? Not the one you set with them. It happens internally. It's a set of realistic expectations we have about the limitations of these relationships and the limitations of these as people in our lives. We learn to interact with them differently and stop going to them to get something that they simply cannot and will not give us.
That's such a painful reality. I think we can't put ourselves in people's shoes in that way to know what they have to deal with day in and day out with somebody like this. In your book, you talk about some traits that a narcissist has. So a few are the need for the narcissistic supply, egocentricity, delusional grandiosity, inability to self-regulate. And then I believe you write that it comes from being insecure, basically, overall, right? So I'd like you to unpack that a little bit. And then my follow-up question to that is, do some people have these narcissistic tendencies, but aren't in fact narcissists?
So here's, when we look at narcissism, I think the piece to remember is that we don't ever pull out one strand of it and call it narcissistic. So a person who's merely selfish, for example, is not necessarily narcissistic. We have to make sure they have all the rest of it, right? So we're talking about some of the things on that list you were sharing from the book, or things like an excessive need for validation and admiration, grandiosity, arrogance, inability to regulate their moods. They're often will lash out with rage if they're disappointed or frustrated or stressed. Very low or variable empathy, lots of entitlement, selfishness, they're very superficial and vain. Again, it's never one of those things. It's all of those things. If I gave you an egg, you wouldn't tell me I gave you a cake. You're telling me I gave you an egg. You need a lot of other stuff to happen before that egg becomes a cake, right? So you need all of this stuff to be happening simultaneously together in one person across a variety of situations and for an extended period of time. All of these things I'm talking about, the need to be vaunted as the best and the most wonderful and walk around and saying I am the best and the most wonderful, always focused on appearance and preening and money and sort of snobbery and all of that. These are grandiose defenses that are basically the narcissistic person internally is sort of a cauldron of shame and insecurity. And to keep that at bay, they have these really, really thick fortifications that are very grandiose and entitled and selfish and even mean-spirited. However, sometimes those defenses get breached. For example, the person doesn't get the promotion they wanted, or they see that their friend has a nicer house than them. And at those times of insecurity, the narcissistic person is incapable of just being vulnerable with that moment. Instead, they lash and they rage out at anybody and everybody around them, or anyone they perceive is making them feel bad, or an easy mark, like somebody who has less power and can't fight back. So can a person have all of those qualities and not be narcissistic? Probably not. I can't imagine that you'd ever have an unempathic, entitled, grandiose, dysregulated, validation-seeking, selfish person, and they're not narcissistic. I don't think that's a thing.
I mean, I just had a ding, ding, ding. I think everybody knows somebody, right? I think we're thinking about the same person.
But I was going to ask, so will a narcissist necessarily be unself-aware?
A narcissistic person, by definition, is unself-aware. They have no because to be self-aware then brings up that shame, right? Which they're always trying to avoid. Narcissistic people also tend to shift blame onto other people. They're not accountable. They don't take responsibility. And it's for this reason relationships are forever stunted with the narcissistic person. None of us are perfect in relationships. We are human beings. We are flawed by definition. We make mistakes in relationships all the time. The reason the relationship can move forward is we make amends, we take accountability, we issue true apologies, and we attempt to change our behavior. When that happens, relationships grow. Narcissistic people are incapable of doing that. So when they behave badly in a relationship, they will blame the other person, even though that's the person who was harmed.
But what's interesting is that, I'm thinking about, Monica and I have been married for 27 years. There are times in our arguments, I will shift the blame to her, or sometimes I'm sure.
But not to this extreme.
Not all the time. But so I guess I mean,
that's just ego, but this is a different level of that.
Right. So it sounds to me like if I wanted to assess myself, right, how do I know that I'm not a narcissist?
I don't think you're a narcissist.
No, would the self-awareness piece be the absolute proof?
I think that the self-awareness, the capacity to take responsibility, because again, even in an ugly argument, our tendency is to self-protect. Again, as you said, it's ego, right? We do protect ourselves. It's a natural tendency. But when tempers have cooled and things have settled down, it's also the capacity to have the humility. And narcissism really is the absence of humility. It's the capacity to have the humility where we reach out and say, what I did was not okay, and I'm sorry. I take responsibility for that. I hurt you. And I am so sorry. And I hope I can make it right. So it's a real vulnerable putting oneself out there, right? That's the piece that even when we blame shift, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. You knew I was going through a lot of stuff. We do that, right? That's normal. But the question is that do we just leave it hanging there? Or is there a point when we put on our big kid pants and actually face up to the harm we caused to another person and attempt to make it right? We can't do that every day. You can't blame shift every day and keep apologizing. That's not going to work either. But when it does happen, when we do get into those bigger arguments, it is that capacity to look inward and again, be humble.
Yeah.
Well, I think you gave an example or analogy in your book about how when we look at a hunter and its prey, we tend to focus on the hunter and not the lion, for instance, right? So would you say that a way to kind of spot a narcissist, of course, not always, because people sometimes are victims, but you kind of look at the prey. So when I was reading the chapter on what does narcissist abuse do to us, there were three things, because I did have a relationship with somebody who really clearly, I mean, as you're talking, it's like shouting out at me, very clearly a narcissist. And I didn't know that until, I knew them for over 20 years. But it says part of what happens to the person that is on the other side of that, right, in a relationship with a narcissist is that they tend to think like this. They can't really stand their ground. They're the ones who are asking themselves, what am I doing wrong? And then they become hopeless, right? And then you talk about the fallout and the 3 R's, if you can take us through that as well. But would you say that's a good way to that's an indication if a person then starts to become very, very small in the relationship? Much to Natalia, right? The example of the woman who had a law degree and a medical degree, but had lost all of her sense of self.
Correct. So it just doesn't happen overnight, right? And nobody's opener is to leave you feel hopeless in a relationship, right? Initially, when somebody is pushing back on us, typically gaslighting us, doubting reality, doubting experience, doubting perception, telling us there's something wrong with us, telling us it's our fault, we do stand our ground. We'll say, hey, slow down. That's not true. But you got to remember there's another thing that's happening in the relationship, which is you are in a relationship with this person. And many times in a narcissistic relationship, it's been really good for a while, especially those early months. There's this love bomb sort of idealized and very seductive period. So there's a lot of buy-in and you want to keep the relationship going, but you also want it to be balanced. So you'll say, whoa, not okay. But then they'll come in, they'll double down on the gaslighting. They'll tell you there's something wrong with you or that you're being selfish or ungrateful or what's wrong with you. Or they might even pull out the sort of the big weaponry and start saying, well, I guess you really aren't that into this relationship if you're going to be so difficult. So it's almost dangling this kind of abandonment out there. So now the other person is starting to think, well, maybe I am pushing too hard. Maybe I am being difficult. And if you had a narcissistic parent, this isn't your first time hearing that kind of rhetoric. So what happens is a person might start giving in, saying, okay, maybe I am being unreasonable. Maybe I am being difficult. Maybe I am asking too much. And what a person finds is the more you give in, the less you take those arguments, the smaller you become, the more peacefully this relationship seems to run. But in that translation, you slowly start quitting on yourself. Now, when this happens in an adult relationship, it's obviously very different for a child with a narcissistic parent. The child has no choice but to give in to the parent. As an adult, we do ostensibly have a choice, but it's sort of a choice is a tricky word to me because there's an entire other physiological process that makes us want to attach and affiliate and connect. And that's very powerful. So if we believe that certain actions we can take will allow us to maintain that connection, we do it, even if it's to our detriment. Over time, their bad behavior continues, and we really recognize there's nothing we can do. And so that's when we see things like anxiety, sadness, even depression, helplessness, hopelessness, powerlessness, rumination, all kind of kick in. That's sort of what that cycle looks like. And that can take years and years to happen. Over this period of time, people become increasingly isolated. They're almost embarrassed by what's happening, especially because to the world, their relationship looks normal. The happy little holiday card goes out. They still host their nice little dinner parties. Life looks normal to the world. And when the doors close and everybody leaves the dinner party, the narcissistic person starts in on them. There's no audience to it. And so you're becoming smaller, but nobody's clear why. And because most people don't understand narcissism, they're more likely to doubt the survivor of the relationship and say, oh, relationships are hard, marriages are tricky, you're going to have your good days and your bad days, not recognizing that this person has literally been subjugated. And that's the only way they can maintain this attachment, this connection, this relationship. And they're riddled with self-blame and self-doubt. So to your point about what these 3 R's are, What happens to most survivors of narcissistic relationships is they ruminate, ruminate, ruminate. They obsess. Did I say the right thing? Did I say it that way? Did I not send that text? Did I forget to do that? Maybe I wasn't nice enough. Oh, I should have figured out. I should have known they would have felt that way. People ruminate about literally not being able to read the narcissistic person's mind. So it's this constant like, why did we get into that argument? Or I'm so confused because it is confusing. It's a relationship that's predicated on destabilization. There's also a lot of regret about what the person did in the relationship. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I'm asking too much. Maybe I'm the reason he cheated. I did put on some weight. Well, since the kids came, this, so there'll be that whole thing. And then there's something we call euphoric recall. Narcissistic relationships often fall into this pattern we call trauma bonding. And trauma bonding is the connection that's created in a relationship where there's a lot of alternating between good and bad. There's good moments sprinkled into the bad ones. And the good moments provide the sort of the juice for the justifications a person will make about the relationship. The relationship itself is very flimsy and it is not at all safe. But to feel safe in the relationship, the trauma bonded person will basically craft a false narrative and take responsibility for everything that's happening to maintain the attachment. The euphoric recall is part of that trauma bonded sequence. It's people selectively remembering the good things. So, despite a week of being humiliated, mocked, minimized, ignored, not empathized with, and gaslighted, the person will say, "Oh, we had such a good time last month when we went on that weekend away to wherever." And 100 terrible things have happened since. And I remember years ago working with someone and they were 25 years of a horrifically toxic narcissistic marriage and kept saying, "My God, but we had this really great night in Rio and we danced all night." I'm like, Rio, like that was 27 years ago. But they
Wow.
still bring up that night in Rio like it happened last week, because that was such a foundational part of the justification structure. That's what I mean about euphoric recall. And it's something that's very common. People are afraid, if I walk away from this, what if they change? It's like a slot machine, right? And the entire structure of this relationship is a slot machine. It's intermittent reinforcement. Like, what if I walk away and the next pull is what brings the jackpot? And so people fritter away their entire lives thinking that they're going to hit the proverbial jackpot and start dancing in Rio again.
I have the chills as you're speaking. So it sounds like this is a survival mechanism that unknowingly they've created because they have been so whittled down to nothing through being in this kind of relationship that they just don't think that they can have better, do better, get better. And so they need to make this reality work no matter what. So it's kind of like the lie we tell ourselves, the story we craft.
It's not that active. So I don't even think it's something that the person in the relationship has created. I think this really digs deeper into very reflexive trauma systems in our bodies, in our brains, that a person is sort of flooded alternately with absolute fear and then absolute ecstasy. It's like you're going between dopamine and the fear network in your brain. Fear, dopamine. That's a deadly combination, because a person will say, what the problem is, what brings the dopamine, that drops more and more and more. So now a person is like, "Oh my gosh, we had a terrible argument. Oh my God, I don't know. I can't put up with this anymore." And then they'll come in and say, "Hey, it's your birthday. I brought home a pizza." Dopamine. And this should be a lot better than just pizza on your birthday. And so, but they're flooded with this joy, right? Now this joy is getting imprinted into this relationship again. But it's that alternation, that seeking of safety, which is such a primal need, that it's not so much that nobody's rolling up saying, looking for a little bit of safety here. It is a very, very hardwired. That's why people look at themselves like, ew, why did I do that? But it's not ew. Our sympathetic nervous system responses, whether they're fight or flight or freeze or fawn, are involuntary responses designed to keep us safe. Nobody's intentionally fighting or freezing or fawning. It happens because we're trying to feel safe. So it's not necessarily created by the person. It's the being able to get the drone's eye view of what's happening in this relationship, what this personality is about, understanding above all else, it's not going to change. The slot machine's never going to pay out. And you're always going to be at a deficit in this relationship. And so that big piece of info, which most people don't get, it's never going to change. And then make your decisions accordingly. That's where this process of healing begins.
So that's a big part of your work then, would you say? You take your clients to that place of radical acceptance.
Yep.
You talk about soul distancing in your book. And I thought this was really interesting because, and I want you to explain it obviously much better than I can, but what I thought was interesting about it is, as part of your recommendation for people who won't leave the marriage, let's say, right? For a host of reasons. They have children, they're just too invested in staying there. You talk about how they've learned to not share their deepest thoughts or vulnerabilities or what can be used against them, right? Like, I have this great idea, I want to create that. And I think the example you gave the husband's like, no, you're just lucky. And that's any success you've ever had is just luck. Nothing you think is going to work. But I guess for me, and obviously, well, not obviously, but I'm sharing with you, we are in a healthy relationship. That feels inauthentic, right? Like I understand it to do that with a boss or even with a sibling, right? But with a partner or your child, it feels like you almost have to shut the deepest, truest parts of yourself off to the person you're supposed to share your life and your vulnerabilities and be the most you possible with, right? So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, the person you're supposed to be able to do that with is not showing up as a safe person. So they get nothing. And the only reason you're continuing to interact with them might be through some misplaced sense of obligation or an honestly placed sense of obligation or necessity or money or any of that. So the relationship, the narcissistic relationship by definition is an inauthentic relationship. If you show up as your true self, you will be destroyed. So I don't feel comfortable sending someone into that space. I would say you've got to figure out a way to do the deep dive into your authentic self. And the narcissistic person doesn't get to see it because they don't get to have nice things because they ruin them. And that's where the soul distancing comes from. No, it's not authentic, but it is. Listen, 99% of, maybe 90, we'll give the 10% of those trauma bonded people it out. 90% of people in narcissistic relationships want out. Many fantasize about the death of their spouse. They fantasize about a way to get out of this mess. They said, if someone dropped $1 million on my doorstep, I'd be out of here. Family court was a sane place. I'd be out of here. If the minute my kids turn 18, I've known people, the minute their kids turned 18, they got in a car and they drove and they filed for divorce that second because there was no longer the fight around custody was over. So
you're talking about survival.
Systems, you know what I'm saying? So it's survival. They're not, so they don't, it's not that anybody wants to be, inauthentic, but of course they can't be authentic. Like I think to show up as your authentic self, to have it chronically destroyed, that ends up destroying the authentic self, which is what has happened to most people in these relationships. I think the way I really want to caution you is that when we put the onus on the survivor of the relationship as the one being inauthentic, once again, we're shaming them. The shame here belongs squarely on the shoulders of the person who's emotionally abusive and has created the conditions whereby somebody does not safely have the capacity to show up as their true selves. Soul distancing then becomes a way of being safe in a relationship where you have to show up for whatever structural or other reasons you still do.
Yeah, just to clarify, I don't believe in shame at all, and certainly not for any person who is enduring this kind of relationship. I just feel empathy for them and compassion, and I think they deserve a medal because I'm saying that to have to be in that kind of relationship where you have to hold that, that truest part just to yourself is lonely and isolating and pain. I feel the pain there, right? So
it's tremendous pain, but there's other places to take it. I think one thing to remember, to your point, is it does bring up a lot of compassion. Certainly in me, it's why I've devoted my life to this, is how do we help people though? Because I think this authentic part of everyone, it's gorgeous and it's stunning and the world needs to see it. It's the source of all good things. I think we get caught into this sort of unfortunate loop of our marriage is our most important relationship or the parent is a sacred relationship. There are people who have gone through narcissistic relationships who will say, I have this gorgeous group of friends. There's 3 close friends who have gotten me through it. They are my loves. They are my core. They are my hearts. And I can be my true self with them. The grief is this thing called marriage did not work for them. And it's to excise that and recognize they gave it a shot. It didn't work out that way in their lives, but there are other places that they can bring this authentic self. And so I'd like to tell survivors, it's not all lost. It may not be the sort of fairy tale happy ending you want, but fairy tales are a bit hegemonic anyhow. So I feel like this idea of there are other places in your life. It may be in a community of support community you're in. It may be through your work, maybe through volunteering. It may be in the strangest places you find that you can bring your whole self and you're safe. And when that happens, I always tell folks, pay attention to how you feel after you spend time with someone. If you feel a few inches taller, that's a keeper. But if you feel depleted and like you have to take a nap, every red flag should be going up for you. And so, and I think that that's the distinction, is that people are like, wait a minute, it's really interesting you say that. I was with, talking with this sort of strange group I know from my exercise class, and we go out for a juice afterwards. And I just feel like I feel so emboldened afterwards. I'm like, those are your people. I mean, I think chosen family is such an important construct for people who are going through these narcissistic relationships. And I think people fight themselves to the death trying to make the sort of their biological bad luck work out, that they have to find other soft and safe places to land, and that that's okay.
I love that you said that. And I love that those examples. And I think it's really empowering. I often tell people, because I help a lot of couples with their relationships, and I often say, you have to grieve the life you thought you would have so you can create the life that you can have, right? And I think, to your point, with grief, it's to really say, okay, it's not going to happen here in this area in this way, but I certainly can choose another place to still have those deep, meaningful experiences.
Absolutely. And I think that that's where the big part of the healing and the huge central core piece of it is finding your people. And for many people who've been isolated for a long time in their narcissistic relationship, either literally they weren't allowed to really be in the world, or in the sense of feeling my marriage is weird and I don't want people to see it and I'm embarrassed of it. They may have gotten cut off, or their spouse was very anti anyone socializing with them, so they got isolated that way, that they're having to start from scratch in a way and really sort of build up slowly. For some people, that person they can show up with authentically initially is a therapist. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because at least it's a place they can say, oh, I can be my true self and I'm not being shut down or yelled at or shamed or humiliated. What? And so
Right.
that's a big moment for a person who then might use that as a jumping off place to feel safer, to maybe try that in other places too.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I was reading the book also, it came to mind that, as you mentioned as well, that adult relationships is one level of pain. But then when children grew up in a family where one of the parents were narcissistic, and I wanted to ask you, in your experience, how difficult is it for people to realize, oh, my mom wasn't just not a great mom, she was a narcissist. And that's why, I have these wounds that I have. How difficult is it for people to actually realize that?
It takes a minute, right? I think it takes people well into adulthood. Though I have to say, I'm pretty heartened to see that seeing a generation of younger people, because there's so much more information out there about invalidating and emotionally immature and narcissistic parents, that people are picking up on this in their 20s and are getting much better at sort of, in some cases, setting a line, being aware of what happened or what was done to them and all of that. But because many people are trauma bonded with their narcissistic parent, it can take a long time for them to see that parent with a clean lens. In many ways, they feel as though they're betraying the parent by viewing them in that way. And that can get really magnified if the parent themselves had a very difficult backstory. So you start getting into intergenerational patterns of saying like, well, they were even far more physically abused by their parent than I was. So it's no wonder that they abused me. And part of the healing work becomes, even if we can create a coherent model of understanding why the narcissistic person behaves the way they do, that we also have to be willing to give ourselves permission to say, and their behavior was unacceptable. Multiple things can be true at the same time. Behavior can be unacceptable, and we can understand the origin of that unacceptable behavior, but knowing that origin doesn't allay the pain that you experience. And for many folks, they'll say, I didn't even know what healthy looked like. I didn't even know that this was possible. And that's again where therapy becomes interesting, because I've had many clients say, the way you interact with me is what I always dreamed a mother would do, right? That's that maternal transference. And it's a way for us to talk about what's happening in that therapy room is so simplistic. I'm showing up when I said I'd show up. I'm attuned to them. I care about them. I'd argue that therapists love their clients and their fashion, but there's someone who's present and wants what's good for them, right? That's what a mother is supposed to be. But to them, it's a revelation. And then that becomes a place where they're saying, whatever's happening here's the opposite of what I grew up with. And so we kind of back into those revelations on what happened to them was unacceptable. And honestly, to your point, it's less important as sort of clocking the parent as narcissistic than it is to say what happened to you as a child, that wasn't okay. And it hurts you and you're not defined by it. We can certainly step you back from that, but it wasn't okay. And just a person being able to hold on to the not okayness of it is a huge step forward in cutting some of those trauma bonded patterns.
Well, in speaking about children, what do you feel that parents should know about narcissistic traits as they see their children developing? And the flip side of that, what kinds of qualities should we be fostering in our children so they're less likely to become narcissists and more likely remember their own self-worth if they encounter a narcissist? So how do we kind of help navigate that?
Right. So there's sort of three questions there, right? So let's talk about the first is how do you make a narcissist, right? Because that's really what parents of younger children want to know, right? Because it is very much a social developmental phenomenon. And a lot of that happens at home. And that's not to say, because I think a lot of parents will feel a lot of grief when they turn around and see that their adult child is narcissistic. And one of the first things they wonder is, how was I complicit in this? And sometimes their complicity was really at the level of that parent who has compassion for their child, but is being very, very harmed by their child in many ways, realizes that they themselves were once married to a narcissist. So maybe now the co-parent is narcissistic. Maybe they're even divorced. And that's one influence. But many times when people are married to narcissistic people or raising kids with narcissistic people, until they understand what narcissism is, they're simply overwhelmed and preoccupied with the narcissistic person, that other person they're in a relationship with. So they unplug from their kids. That preoccupation, there's only so much bandwidth we've got. And if it's all going to try to please this narcissistic adult, then no, you didn't show up for those kids. It's not that you harmed them. It's not that you abused them. But in the midst of having this one selfish parent, they saw the other parent with their eyes totally on that other parent, right? So nobody was minding the kids. And so that can sometimes be an origin too. Narcissism is begotten out of not just the social developmental environment, but also the biological vulnerability of a child. It's like their biological temperament. That's why in one family you can have 4 siblings and only one is narcissistic and 3 are not. There had to be some difference, and it's often biological. And so that's that temperament difference. But everyone lived through the same invalidating home and came out not narcissistic, except maybe 1, maybe 2. So we do see that sort of difference play out too. But if you're the parent of a younger child and saying, I want to get this right, there's a couple of things. Number one, attunement, attachment, attunement, attachment. I can't say it enough. You've got to be present with your kids. They have to believe that they're valuable enough for someone to attune to them, but not so special that the world stops for them. Because I think we're seeing an overcorrection where everyone's like, well, the 4-year-old must speak. And I'm thinking like, what strange empire have we walked in here? I think 4-year-old can, we can put a pin in the 4-year-old for a minute. And so we've gone to the overindulgence, that kid thinking they're more special than anyone around them. That's one way to make a narcissist. The other way to make a narcissist is adversity, unattunement, attachment fails, trauma, and abuse. So what you're trying to do is create that middle path of an authoritative parent who's available, warm, receptive, and responsive, but also sets consistent boundaries, creates a place of psychological safety where that child can safely explore themselves in their world, not believe that they're going to be shut down. Everyone can sort of be their true selves, and their true selves are valued. And that is how you don't make a narcissist. And that's not a line. A lot of people right now, everyone's trying to make Instagram accounts out of their kids. And don't I have the cutest kid in the world? We're just now seeing the first cohort of kids that were raised with social media from cradle to now that we don't have the data yet. That data is going to come in soon. And I don't think it's going to be very pretty.
That's terrifying.
I really don't.
I mean, this is kind of off topic, but it just reminded me. I don't know if you've seen those social media clips where parents crack an egg on their kid's forehead and then see the reaction. I'm not sure.
It's not okay.
No, it's not okay. And there's a ton of things like that. And they're just like stunned and shocked. And I'm like, you were creating so much distrust in your child. I mean, there's so many things, but
it's the distrust, but it's also the child as prop. So you've objectified your child too. And that objectification is part of the process of subjugation, where the child is really, really sort of gets the message that I exist for the parent's needs, that the parent's needs come foremost. The child is almost in the role of being for the parent. The child's needs, wants, and feelings are shamed. The child's true self is shamed because they exist in the service of the parent. And that precedent results in some pretty anxious and often destabilized kids, adolescents, and then who go into adulthood.
You also talk about, I thought this was really interesting, which I hadn't heard this term, but after I read it, it's a tool that you share on how to deal with toxic people in your life. And interestingly enough, there was one relationship that I tried. I'm a really solid communicator. I mean, when I tell you I tried everything for years. And then I read this and I was like, and I only started doing this 4 months ago with this person, and it's working amazingly. It's called gray rocking. Can you explain that to our listeners? But when I had a name, I was like, oh my God, I figured this out without knowing it was a thing.
Yeah. So gray rocking is an old school kind of toxic communication tool where where a person that basically, so you become as sort of unengaged as a gray rock. It's almost imagine yourself at a deposition. Yes, no, not clear, not sure. And it's sort of a very flat emotional style. And it's kind of a just the facts kind of a communication. Gray rock's tricky. In fact, Tina Swithin, a colleague and friend of mine, developed a twist on gray rock called yellow rocking. I like yellow rocking better because yellow rocking actually feels a little more authentic. It's infused with a little bit more warmth. She developed yellow rocking as a tool for people who are co-parenting with a toxic, co-parent, as a way to not sort of leave the kids sort of feeling like, ooh, this is cold and weird. Because sometimes the gray rocker is viewed as the antagonist because they are sort of like kind of closed off, right? So yellow rocking is the same thing, but it's like, oh, yeah, I see. Oh, you did that. Is that park still open? You're not talking about anything, but there's a little bit of the nature of the voice captures the truth of us a little bit more, but we're not going to get into it with them, right? We're never definitely the K of gray rocking, yellow rocking is to not let them pull you back into the mud, into conversations that are rather quickly going to become blamey and gaslighty and all of that. So all of these are called low contact strategies, gray rock, yellow rock, even this thing I call firewalling. And firewalling is this sense of watching the information that comes in and goes out. So it's things like you don't share good news with them. You don't share bad news with them. You don't share sensitive topics with them. You really sort of stick to sort of sports, news, weather. And these days you can't even do news. So sports and weather, like, look at that. The daffodils came out. Oh my gosh, it's raining. Did you read about the floods in Ireland? Like there's no conversation there. And people will say, that makes me sad. Are you telling me with this person I've been with for 30 years, all I can do is talk about the weather? I'm like, if you don't want to fight with them, yeah. And some people will say this low contact strategy brings into stark focus what this relationship really is, because they know if they take a step too many, they're going to get dragged back into the mud. But to your point, we can't leave all these relationships. So in some cases, these communication strategies allow people to kind of maintain the interaction at family events or weddings or work meetings or when the kids are being dropped off at the soccer game or any of those kinds of situations.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful tool because you stop blaming yourself for not being able to fix a relationship that's not fixable. You stop ruminating. You stop going, oh, I should have said. It's just all the things that are wrong, as we mentioned at the beginning. I found this tool that I use with one specific person. It's really liberating. There's a freedom that kind of comes with it, and you're able to be stable, not shifted any which way because of their lack of, whatever, instability. There's another I loved your book. Clearly, I wanted you to talk about this because even the example you gave, which maybe I shouldn't say because it's literally my example in my life, which you talk about flying monkeys and how that person does the bidding for the narcissist. In essence, they enable them because they overwhelm you with the narcissistic person's rhetoric. And this happens, I think, a lot in families, and it invalidates, or it can invalidate your experience because they're so quick to say, but that person, if you don't show up to the family event, you know how they're going to feel, or if you don't come to their birthday, like as if you did something wrong. So share with us flying monkeys?
Yeah. So flying monkeys is sort of, again, anyone who's not familiar with the story of the Wizard of Oz, the flying monkeys were these sort of rather terrifying winged monkeys that did the Wicked Witch's bidding and would, terrify people on her behalf. And flying monkeys basically are a band of enablers, but usually enablers that are acting from a place of harm. Sometimes enablers are just sort of the like, oh, they didn't really mean that kind of person, or people who just say nothing, or people who just go along because they want Christmas or Thanksgiving to go the way they want. But the flying monkeys are more active. They get in there and they really try to sort of they will either launch a smear campaign and share, uncomfortable or untrue gossip in a group of people. They will be they might spread rhetoric about your situation to other people. They may come and tell you things like, don't you feel guilty for, ruining her wedding by this, or don't you feel bad, or like literally, like trying to draw negative emotion out of a person that's already being harmed by a situation. The situation of flying monkeys can actually be, for some people, more devastating than the narcissistic relationship, because after a while, people are like, okay, I get this narcissism thing. I get it. That's who this person is. I'm staying away from them. But they may have still thought that the flying monkeys were their friends or their family or people they could trust. So when that gets eroded, for a lot of people, it feels like an implosion, like, wait a minute, not only am I like this other narcissistic relationship, I'm identifying it for what it is. Now this other stuff's falling apart. So you can imagine too, that can really, really amp up that sense of self-doubt and self-blame of like, I don't want to lose everybody, or what's happening, or maybe it's me, because it can't be that everyone else is wrong. But it is, some people will say the flying monkey smear campaign experience of the narcissistic relationship was actually more devastating and more harmful than the experience of the one-on-one narcissistic relationship, especially when they got the narcissistic piece figured out.
Totally. I looked at my husband because we went through a time in our lives where literally there were a lot of flying monkeys around us. And I remember turning to him one day, and then I repeated that sentiment for many, many months to follow. I was like, are we the only people that can see, or are we crazy and we don't know anything and everybody else can see? Because it's like, if it's so overwhelming when you have these voices around you, you start to doubt if what you're experiencing is even true.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And that's where I'm saying that these enabler flying monkey experiences, you've already been destabilized by potentially what was a dyadic toxic relationship. But when this next part happens, it can almost cement it, and people can take a long time. It's almost like being in a cult. And in fact, cultic systems are very flying monkeys laden systems. So when a person kind of has the wake up call that this is a cult, clearly an abusive cult leader, but then the flying monkeys come in to do the bidding of the cult leader. It's why many people can get stuck in those systems or terrified or terrorized by those systems for a very long time.
So interesting.
And so I wanted to ask you something, a bigger picture question. I saw you've spoken about this as well. The desire to do big things in the world. So that can lead people towards narcissism. And we know people like that. On the other hand, there are people like yourself who do actually want to do good in the world. How do you, I guess, protect yourself? How do you make sure it's coming from the right place, that narcissism isn't playing a role, right? That difficult fine line to walk.
Are you saying a lot of the characteristics that a narcissist has is something that is needed to be successful? Is that what you're kind
Dr. Ramani, I think you said many of the successful people in the world are narcissistic. But on the other hand, you have a lot of good people who also want to do big things in the world. How do you protect?
You got to tap into some of that, though, I would imagine.
Yeah. So how do you protect yourself? How do you know that it's coming from the right place and not from a narcissistic place if you're putting yourself out there in big ways in the world?
It's a great question, because I think anybody who's in a public facing role, present company included, will have to sit and say, what is this about? What do I need? What am I getting from this? It's really about intention, right? Here's where it gets tricky. The narcissistic person isn't sitting at home saying, well, I'm clearly just doing this to get narcissistic supply and attention, and that's what it's about. So I would say that for ourselves, it's about meaning, purpose, intention. What's the what? Like, why are we doing this? Is another way we could do this? I know for me personally, I'm going to be frank with you. If I could do this anonymously, I would have done it a long time ago. Like, it's not at all in my nature to want to be public. I'm a very, very private, introverted person. But I knew this was the only way to get this conversation going, was to give this information away for free. That's where we started on YouTube and writing about it. So it's the nature of our world. But if, like, again, if someone told me tomorrow, no one's going to know who you are anymore, I'd be like, oh my goodness, thank heaven above. But I just need to make sure I'm still getting a salary so I can pay the bills. It definitely is about us looking into what our intentions and motivations are. So I think that all of it's, I do think that monthly self-studies are part of being a human being. Like, what am I doing? What's my intention here? What am I hoping for? And if a person says, well, I'm doing this to make money, I'd say, that's great. Then what does money mean to you? Like, we really have to sort of, it's that the way we would do a self-study for a company, we need to do those for ourselves. But a narcissistic person's never, ever going to do that. I thought, though, where your question was going is, what if you're working with someone who you're absolutely inspired by what they're doing in the world? You're like, whoa, this is amazing. This is such a cool person. They're doing such amazing things in the world. How do you protect yourself before you kind of get caught in that vortex? And I think that's actually a meaningful question, too, because I'm going to be very frank with you, and this is a big thing for me to say, but when I look at what have been some of the massive innovations in the last 50 years, where I think we've had more innovations in 50 years than we had in the prior 5,000, if you leave out things like movable type and the wheel and things like that. But really, we've had stuff happen in the last 50 years. I'm 58 years old. So the things we do now, my 8-year-old self couldn't have fathomed having what I couldn't even conceive of was a computer in my hip pocket. Like, we live in a world most of us who grew up at another time can't conceive of. And the fact is, a lot of these tech folks and everything, they're grandiose. They're grandiose. They're arrogant. They don't.
Would you say narcissistic? Would you say narcissistic?
They're probably, many of them are also narcissistic, but I think that they're grandiose, arrogant. You can't stop me, believing in something so much, almost ridiculously bigger than themselves. Change the world, not always in good ways, but we have to know that there were some good things that came of it. And I will grudgingly agree that we could not have had that innovation without that kind of unfettered grandiosity. I'm telling you, probably not to marry these people, but ultimately, if you're going to work with someone like that, you may have tremendous admiration for their intellect, for their creativity, for even their vision. But working for them may be no picnic. So just because somebody has these fantastical visions of the world doesn't mean they know how to treat human beings. And I think that we sometimes get caught in the cult of look at what this person's done. That's all good and well. But at the end of the day, when you're making a decision for yourself, you have to pay attention to whether you feel safe, seen, and heard in their presence. And if you don't, probably not going to be a healthy landing for you there.
Yeah. And that's really important, because I think maybe it's human nature to say, if this person is so accomplished in the business world, then he must be an amazing person in all areas of their life.
No. And in fact, I always tell folks, smart is not a virtue. Rich is not a virtue, especially smart. Rich, I think most of us don't think rich people are super nice, but smart, we think, many clients of mine have said the mistake I made, because they'll say, how did I get lost? And this person was terrible. How did I get lost? When they play the track all the way back, they'll say, one of the things I noticed about them early on was that they were so intelligent, so smart. And they took that intellect to be a virtue. Intelligence at best is a parlor trick. It can be cultivated. It ain't all that. Warmth, kindness, respect, patience, safety, reciprocity, that's the good stuff. But the smart, smart. And so, but I think we do treat it as a virtue, and that's a huge mistake. So we also do that with skill, like a person who's an amazing musician or an amazing artist or an amazing chef. I'm like, they have a skill. The trick they know how to do doesn't make them a good person.
Yep. But we idolize, and we
Yes,
want
we
it. We want it to be it all. I wanted to ask you, this is my last question for you. You talk about how to embrace radical acceptance, and you share the story of the scorpion and the swan, which there are many different children's books. My youngest has one it's like an alligator, and I think there's a bunny sitting on a fox. I don't know. Anyway, that's this tale where the scorpion asks the swan for a ride, and, charms the swan and love bombs it. And, and then of course the swan trusts it and gets to their side. And what happens? You can imagine what the scorpion does. But you talk about a few different things on how to embrace radical acceptance. You talk about grieving the death of the narcissist, gaslight resistant and rewriting your story and forgiveness. And I thought this was really interesting and powerful. And that's why I want you to share it. I would think that forgiveness would be the first thing. Like, I'm going to forgive, I'm going to choose to see this a different way and go from there. And most people would think, of course, forgiveness is such an important part of moving on, but you make such a valid point on why, when dealing with the narcissist, dare I say, it's dangerous. I mean, how would you explain that?
Yeah, that section of the book is called The Treachery of Forgiveness. And I have to say, forgiveness really is a dangerous space in narcissistic relationships. While there's a really robust literature out there that talks about the virtues of forgiveness, it doesn't apply here. Because forgiveness, when you look at the dictionary definition, is to also cease to feel resentment towards the offender. Let me tell you this, most people in these relationships do not cease to feel resentment. Why? Because a narcissistic person is a serial offender. They keep doing the bad thing, and many of them will receive the forgiveness almost as permission of like, okay, well, looks like I'm just going to be able to keep doing this and get away with it. And so people keep forgiving because that's what they're told. In fact, many people are forgiveness shamed. Well, you're a very cold person, you're not going to forgive. But the research also shows that if you forgive someone who repeatedly betrays you or harms you or, betrays your trust, that actually harms the person who's doing the forgiving. So forgiving is not this easy sort of like kind of whiteout that makes everything go away. Forgiveness can be extraordinarily powerful when you're dealing with two self-reflective people, and the person being forgiven receives the forgiveness and turns that into meaningful change so that the person sees that the forgiveness they engaged in, which is not an easy thing to do when someone's harmed us, but that forgiveness turns into growth. That's how it's supposed to work. That is not how it works in a narcissistic relationship. And many people will say, I was either shamed for not forgiving, so I forgave, and then they did it to me again. And then I felt foolish. And I thought, well, maybe I'm the sucker. It's actually called the doormat effect. And so I would say that forgiveness is an incredibly personal decision. But the point I make very clear to survivors is that it is not required for healing. Many people 100% heal and never forgive and say what this person did to me was actually unforgivable. It changed the course of my life and not necessarily in good ways. And while they'll say, I've tried to make meaning out of the suffering, I would have done better without having had the suffering in the first place. And so I know we like to round up and clap hands for people who forgive under such terrible circumstances, and it makes for a good feel-good story. I don't know that it makes for a healing story. Some people say, I forgave them after they died. Some people said, I never forgave them. Some people said, I forgave them 15 years down the road. And they said, I forgave. And some people said, I never forgave, but I kind of became indifferent towards them. I actually didn't care what happened, but I still hold within me that what they did repeatedly to me wasn't okay. And so, no, I don't forgive them, but I actually don't give a damn about them either. So I think, and some people forgive, and some people have asked me, can I forgive and heal? And I said, absolutely, but it has to be authentic. It can't be sort of pseudo forgiveness that you're doing performatively or to get people off your back. It has to be felt forgiveness. The vast majority of people in these relationships, it takes a very long time for them to get there.
Yeah. And I suppose to your point, it's at the right time. And usually if they're able to be distant, that person's no longer being able to abuse them. Right. It's.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually it's a little bit off topic, on topic, but I saw you speaking about this and I found it very interesting. Maybe share with our listeners your journey from not having that big of an audience and suddenly some of your students came together maybe share that story. I found it both fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working in this area of trying to understand narcissism and how it shows up in areas and in the healthcare industry and how people care for themselves, how it shows up in relationships. Was doing it in my research. I was doing it in my clinical practice. I'd written books. The books didn't do that well. And some students approached me and said, you should have a YouTube channel. I said,
how many years ago? Sorry, how many years ago?
YouTube. They initially approached me probably around 2018 or so. And I had actually decided to leave media in 2017. I'm like, I'm getting a little long in the tooth for this and nobody wants to hear an old lady talk about stuff. So I was about to pull up stakes and I ended up doing a video with a young person here in LA, just I thought because I was being a nice person. And then that video got like 1.5 million hits, which in 2017 was a lot of hits. Started working with a digital media company called MedCircle, where we made a fair amount of content on narcissism and a related personality style. And those got a lot of traction. That's when those students approached me. So we built a YouTube channel, and it was really the kind of thing where we just, it was like the little engine that could. We tried different things, but I mean, for me, it was just an opportunity to say, if people knew this, I think they'd probably suffer less, because half of what I did in therapy was educating people. And I know most people couldn't afford to get into therapy. They weren't going to come to LA, get therapy with me. So I thought, let me just give them what I was going to share with anyone and see what they do with it. And then we got to the point of posting. Then the pandemic came. And right before the pandemic, we did like this thing called 31 Days of Narcissism, and the channel had a bit of a bump. And then it was just diligence. It was putting our head down. There was no viral moment when the channel jumped from 100,000 to a million. It was like every day we got more subscribers. Every day we put out more content. And then it became interactive. Like the comments on the channel, the conversations I was having, those fueled the content. The channel then became responsive to the viewer. So what started as a YouTube channel that had like 1,000 subscribers and made $1 a month, we're at almost 1.7 million subscribers, which speaks to the scale of this issue. I'd love to sit here and say, oh, it's because Dr. Ramani is so smart. I know that's not the case. I think it's just that this issue is hurting and harming so many people, and people are desperate for clarity because they just don't know what to do, and nobody's talking about it. A lot of therapists don't, address it. And so it's been one heck of an interesting journey for the thing that I almost felt like a person who was obsessed with butterflies in the back lab of the university. Like everyone's like, oh, she never leaves the butterflies. With me, it was the narcissist. I read everything I could. I researched it every way I could. And then I thought, but this is so sad that I'm in the back room of the lab. This should actually be getting to people who are struggling. And that's how it happened. Yeah.
Why do you think that many therapists weren't talking about this?
I think that a lot of the way therapy works is that our focus is that we work from what I call very intrapsychically. We work on what's happening within the person, their perceptions, their feelings, their subjective experience in the world, but we don't adequately account for context, which to me is naive, because without understanding the context, like if a person's anxious in a relationship, that the way I'm going to approach them is going to depend on the relationship, and more than anything, the behavior of the other person. And so once I got a handle on that, then I was like, wait a minute, if this person understood what narcissism was, we'd be halfway there. And very rarely would a therapist ever comment on the other person in the relationship. Well, you're the one in the room, so let's help you think differently. I don't think there's a way to think differently about being abused.
Yeah.
And I want to
very solid.
Have you ever had, and I'm assuming you had just on percentages, a narcissist come in to
all the
your
time?
room?
Yeah. I think for the longest time, my practice was 20% narcissist.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if they're not self-reflective, how do you tell them that you think that they're a narcissist?
No, I would tell them their behavior is unacceptable. And so they would come in usually for some other reason: addiction, depression, problems with work, a girlfriend broke up with them, that kind of thing. So there was another thing bringing them in. They weren't coming in saying, hey, I don't have a lot of empathy and I'm entitled, so I'm hurting people's feelings. It wasn't that. And what would happen is, listen, the way I work is I'm going to tell you the truth of my experience with you in this room. And if you don't like it and you don't come back, then I'm not going to lie to you to keep you in this room. That's not how I'm going to roll. So I would be honest, and we would have built rapport by then, and they had enough skin in the game that they'd come back. And sometimes they even say, okay, you called me out. Yep. And I said, and I'm still here and I still care about you. Those two things can coexist. They didn't always like what I had to say. And I think what I found in my work with narcissistic folks was I understood their backstories. I understood the why they were the way they were. I also could say their behavior was unacceptable. I wouldn't have wanted to be in a relationship with them. And the kind of micro shifts I would see, because I was keeping records. There were definitely changes: more respect for the therapeutic frame, showing up on time, communicating with me about cancellations, being more regulated, being respectful with language. I'd see that evolve, but they were such micro changes. They weren't going to be enough to register in the real world. Like the tiny thing we might see change in a lab is not what happens in a real human being's life. That's always been the problem between the pristine kind of therapist room where everything's so careful and what happens in real life. So what I was seeing is that whatever small shifts we could get into place would fall apart quickly, either in the real world or when they got frustrated or life wasn't going the way they wanted. And so it was always the rubber band would always go back to its original size. And I thought, God, this is going to be completely untenable for the people in their lives. So The kind of therapy that somebody who's narcissistic would need would be very long-term with an extraordinarily skilled therapist, maybe even multiple times a week for years. And that kind of access is something that the vast majority of people on this planet don't have.
But also, they don't have, as you said, self-awareness. So what would a narcissist ever even go down that route? Why would they spend the time and energy to change something that...
You'd be surprised with some folks. You know where we see that shift sometimes is folks who are living with addiction and going through 12-step. Big part of 12-step is humility, right? And so there's 50% overlap between addiction and narcissism.
Wow.
So as the addiction gets managed and a person is living it's sober and they're not drinking or using, they may still have all the narcissistic stuff, which by 12-step tenets means they're not sober, frankly, because they're behaving still so selfishly. That humility piece is the hard piece. But some people, for example, who might be committed to 12-step may want to get the rest of the way. So something like addiction can push that. And do narcissists kind of hit what we might call a proverbial rock bottom? Some do. Some will say, I just looked around and everyone's gone. My kids don't speak to me. I just finished my 4th marriage. I'm out of money. My parents are dead. Like I did blow everything up. And sometimes you kind of see that sort of swan song kind of sort of a narcissistic presentation. That's still pretty rare. And so it's a really, really tricky space, because every so often you will see someone who'll say, okay, I just made things a mess. But I've had the opportunity to see some of those cases where people made things a mess, seemed to have humility. Some things got better for them for whatever reason, and they were back to their old ways. And you've got to remember this, just to humanize the narcissist for a minute. We all have a personality. Both of you do. I do. I can speak to mine. I'm an agreeable introvert. So tomorrow I'm not going to go charging down my street and honking my horn and say, get out of my way. I expect to be served first. And I'm never going to go screaming at the receptionist. I'm never going to be the life of the party. I'm just not. That's not who I am. No therapy is going, I might be able to bring it for a night. Maybe I could try to be the life of the party for a night, but then I'll fall asleep for 2 days. It's a whole thing. And so it's the same with a narcissist. Just like you're not going to turn me into someone disagreeable and extroverted, you're not going to turn them into someone agreeable and well-regulated. So personality is really tough to change. And in fact, the healthier the personality, the less rigid it is. So you might have a little more luck with me, but I'm telling you now, I'm never going to be the life of the party.
Interesting. Thank you very much for really sharing all this with us. I strongly recommend for our listeners to get the book, It's Not You. Because I think for many of our listeners, whether they know it or not, they are coming in contact with these narcissists throughout their day. Really appreciate it.
So nice talking to you and meeting you.
So much insight, and I love what you're doing, and it's amazing. And I love that you're doing it as a couple. It's a really, really great podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.